All right. Well, thank you, Chandra. It's great. Lots of things happening in our community, and that's really exciting. If you're new with us, if you're a guest, my name is Paul. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here at Lakeview. And today we are continuing our series at the table. As you can sense from all the hospitable things we're trying to practice and participate in, with all the different meals and different ways we can engage. Muffins today after the service. Who can say no to a muffin? I bet no one can. So make sure you stick around. All right. In 1995, just a year after the fall of the apartheid, South Africa hosted a Rugby World Cup. It was a historic moment in so many ways. For generations, the country had been represented by the green and gold jersey of the Springboks. I think that's how you say it. Green stood for the land, its beauty, its richness. Gold reflected the South Africa's wealth, its resources, its opportunities. Of course, South Africa is famous for its gold mining. And together, this green and gold became more than just colors of the country. They were iconic, worn proudly not only by the rugby players, but also by all the other sports played in South Africa. But rugby was never just a sport in South Africa. Introduced by the British settlers in the 19th century, it became deeply tied to the Afrikaner nationalism and white identity. By the mid-20th century, the Springboks were almost entirely made up of white players. They didn't just represent South Africa, they represented the white South Africa. Now, the non-white players were shut out or often excluded from the team and from all the nation's sporting pride. So, a year after the end of the apartheid, the World Cup came to South Africa in 1995, and it should have been a moment of unity. But for many, it was the opposite. The Springbok jersey was not a symbol of pride anymore. It was a reminder of pain and of painful past and oppression. For the black community, green and gold didn't mean beauty and wealth. It meant exclusion and oppression. And Nelson Mandela knew this better than anyone. Fresh out of 27 years in prison, he had every reason to reject the jersey. He could have condemned it, he could have ignored it, he could have torn it down. But Mandela saw something deeper. He knew that healing, reconciliation, and belonging don't come through exclusion, but through unexpected welcome and invitation. So on the day of the World Cup final, with the eyes of the world watching, Mandela walked onto the field wearing a Springbok jersey and cap. It was an extraordinary act of invitation and welcome. The stadium erupted. The crowd, largely white South Africans who had once called him an enemy, rose to their feet in thunderous applause. In that moment, Mandela wasn't just cheering for a team. He was actually inviting a nation into a new story. And when the Springboks went on to win the championship, Mandela once again walked into the field, still wearing the jersey and cap, standing beside the captain, shook his hand, and in front of the world, without speaking a word, his actions spoke loudly. They said, "You belong. We belong. This country, this field, this table is big enough for all of us." It was a moment of grace. A man who could have chosen bitterness chose instead to extend welcome and invitation. A man who had every right to exclude stepped across the lines of hatred and said, "You are my people too." That's the power of welcome and invitation. That's the power of grace. What happened that day was historic, an extraordinary act of grace embodied and enacted for the whole world to see. And we can marvel at it, we can look back at it and think about what an amazing thing to do. Now, as I was prepping my message for this week and I was reminded of the story and I was reading articles on it, I was deeply moved by it. It is an extraordinary act and step of faith and grace. But I was also reminded that we don't have to wait for the world stage to extend that kind of grace, do we? The very same grace can be offered in the ordinary moments of our lives. In fact, I want to suggest that it is in our ordinary moments of life that these moments or these opportunities to extend this grace actually come to us over and over and over in a more meaningful way. And if I can also suggest those moments of hospitality and those moments to extend an invitation and welcome actually happen most naturally at the table. Because the table is the place where hospitality takes flesh. The table is where reconciliation becomes visible. And no matter where you go in the world, the table is the most ordinary and universal place where hospitality and welcome can be offered. Think about it. Mandela turned a stadium into a table, a place where enemies were suddenly invited to belong. And if a stadium can be transformed like that, how much more the places closer to our homes, like our kitchens, our dining rooms, our coffee tables, restaurants, our office spaces. A table can look like a giant stadium filled with strangers who become united, but most often, it looks like ordinary table in an ordinary room. And at that table, something powerful can happen. Because when we sit at the table, we do more than just fill our stomachs, right? We shape relationships. Tables matter. Tables tell a story. They signal who belong, but also, at their worst, they signal who doesn't. Who is welcomed in and who is left out. And that's what makes it so striking in the Gospels, that Jesus is constantly at the tables. He's constantly eating. He's actually going to a banquet, leaving a banquet, feeding people on the hillside. He's always around food, meals, and hospitality. So last week I said that the how of Jesus' mission was to bring the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven was this. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. This was the how of his mission. So today we're going to look at one of the first at-the-table experiences for Jesus recorded in the Gospel of Luke. So if you have your Bibles with you, you can turn to chapter 5, starting in verse 27, or you can follow along on the screen as we read. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." So leaving everything behind, he got up and began to follow him. Then Levi hosted a grand banquet for him at his house. Now there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others who were reclining at the table with them. But the Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to Jesus' disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus replied to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, for some of you, this might be a very familiar story. Some of you may be reading it for the first time. And when you do hear it or reminded of it, it's tempting for us to just really jump quickly to this conclusion. Because the conclusion is the why of the passage, right? Simply, Jesus came to heal, right? The sick need a doctor, so Jesus shows up and heals. The word for saved in the New Testament is actually, the Greek word means to heal, to rescue. So it's easy for us to jump to that why and the conclusion and go, okay, great, Jesus showed up to do this for the sick. But let's remember, what we are really exploring in our series at the table is the how Jesus carried out his mission. And when we pay attention to the how, Luke's story opens up in a new and surprising way. There are layers here that he wants us to notice. So let's just slow down and lean in a little bit. First, there's this extraordinary call. Jesus invites Levi, the most unlikely of disciples. And just as extraordinary, Levi actually gets up, leaves everything, and follows Jesus. I don't know if you can imagine it. Follow me. Gets up, leaves his office, leaves all the things, and follows. So right from the start, Luke is pressing us to wrestle with this. The very person in Jesus' time who would have been assumed to be disqualified, the one who you were taught to despise, the one branded a traitor, and we'll explain that a little bit later why, but the one that everybody would have thought he's disqualified, that's the one that Jesus actually calls. And then this disqualified person, Levi, responds and follows. So Luke sets the stage for us here, and he isn't done. He wants us to feel the full weight of what's happening here, because this is not just a story about personal conversion. It's a story about invitation, acceptance, and welcome. Jesus extends an invitation to follow. Levi, in turn, extends an invitation to a grand banquet. Both are acts of welcome and hospitality. Both are acts of invitation. Follow me. I'm going to throw you a banquet. And it's here that the tension starts to rise. Not because there's a banquet, Because meals and banquets are normal. We know that. Food is normal. Meals are normal. The problem wasn't the feast. The problem was the guest list. Now, why? Why would that be the problem? Well, it's helpful for us to understand that because the Jewish imagination, you had banquets and feasts for those who belonged to your community. So you did do banquets, you did host meals, you did have feasts, but those that belonged would be invited. And those who don't belong would not be invited. So for a religious leader or a righteous leader, like for the Pharisees, the feast for them would be a banquet for those that's reserved for the righteous people, for the pure, for the Torah keepers, for the faithful remnant, for people like them. It wasn't for tax collectors, it wasn't for sinners, and it wasn't for outsiders. So when Jesus takes a seat at Levi's table, surrounded by tax collectors and their friends, the Pharisees aren't offended by the idea of the banquet. They're offended by the guest list. The problem wasn't the banquet, it was the people at the table. That seems like a simple statement, but just let that sink in. The problem wasn't the banquet, it was the people at the table. Which should make us ask a question. Why is there actually such hostility towards tax collectors? Why are they presented worse than sinners? What's going on? I mean, we can kind of get into the religious mind of the time a little, well, maybe I don't know. I think we can. We can get into the mind and think like, okay, well, yeah, sinners, they don't want to be with sinners. We kind of get that. Outsiders, okay, we always draw our lines, who's in and who's out. We can kind of get behind that. But why such hate for the tax collectors? I mean, I get it. Not a lot of us love taxes. Right? Okay, I had a laughter. So there's agreement there, right? Not a lot of us love it. But our frustrations today would hardly compare to the deep hatred first century Jewish people had towards tax collectors. Why are they seen worse than sinners? What's happening? Well, it's helpful for us to see that tax collectors were despised because they were despised because they, often cheated people and grew rich from corruption. Rome didn't care. Like, Rome was like, hey, get the taxes for us. If you skim more off the top, we don't care. As long as ours is coming to us. So yes, they were people, they were part of corruption, and so people had huge disdain for them. But that's actually part of the story why they were so hated. That actually wasn't the biggest reason why they were disliked. The deeper issue is that they were also collaborators. They worked with Rome so closely. And Rome is this occupying power that oppressed Israel. And this matters actually on a couple of levels. We have to remember that Israel's hope was that God himself would overthrow Rome and restore his kingdom. So this wasn't just Jewish people versus Romans, which sometimes we can position when we read these stories like, yeah, they were oppressed people, so they hated the Romans. Tax collectors worked with the Romans, they kind of disliked them too because they're working with them. That's just part of the story. In the eyes of the Jewish community, in their imagination, it was God versus the Romans. So the tax collectors, they weren't just greedy men lining their pockets by siding with Rome. They were way worse than that. They're not only betraying their own people and aligning with Rome, they were betraying God. They were against God. So in the eyes of Pharisees, the tax collectors weren't simply social outcasts. They were enemies of God himself. And that's what gives this moment its sharp edge. For Jesus to sit at the table with tax collectors wasn't just a matter of bad company. Oh, he's hanging out with bad people. It's actually a theological statement. It's a theological practice. The Pharisees observing Jesus are now asking, Jesus, are you an enemy of God? Because for them, sharing a meal with the tax collectors was nothing less than sharing in their betrayal of God himself. To share a table was to share connection, community. It was to say we belong together. It's like wearing the jersey of your oppressors. This theological idea, this way of understanding the law and God was prevalent in the Jewish imagination and thought and in their teaching. In fact, it was so central in Judaism of Jesus' day that the central question for them was, with whom can I eat? With whom can I eat? Have you had a moment like that? Where you had to decide, can I sit with that person? Can I be seen with them? What about my reputation? What about my plans? What will people think of me if they see me eating with them? What if they see me drinking with them? Now let's go back to the Nelson Mandela story that I started with. If you think that that story is just like this Disney happy ending story, you'd be wrong. For those who had suffered under the apartheid, seeing Mandela, their liberator, wear the jersey of the oppressor felt jarring, even painful at first. There was murmurings in the political circles among the activists who felt he had given away too much, that he crossed the line. The oppressors don't deserve this kind of grace. It's a step too far, Mandela. You're betraying us. Likewise, for some of the white Afrikaner community, there was deep suspicion of Mandela's intentions. They thought maybe this is a political stunt. Maybe he's just gaining support to later turn on us. The question, with whom can I eat, wasn't only the question that the Pharisees asked. It's one we all face. How could you wear that jersey? Now come back with me for a moment to Levi's party. For the Pharisees, what Jesus is doing makes no sense to them because of this. Here's the man who claims to speak and act for God, and yet he welcomes the very people they were convinced were God's enemies. Surely, they thought, that alone proves Jesus cannot be from God. He's disqualified. He's not for us. Maybe, after all, he's actually a collaborator with Rome. Do you see how their position might be, at least in their eyes, reasonable? Unless, of course, God is doing something new. Something so new it refuses to fit into the old categories. Something so new, like offering grace that is so radical and so surprising, so disarming that it turns everything upside down. Now, it's helpful to have context to this story. And so for context, if we look at the broader chapter, just chapter 5 itself, just a few verses earlier in Luke 5, 12 to 15, Jesus touches a leper. Now, we may hear that and be like, yeah, of course, Jesus is awesome. He touches people that others don't, and he's doing things we don't, and he's just awesome. Jesus touches a leper. Everyone in that world knew what that meant. You touch a leper, you're unclean. You're disqualified. That's how the law worked. That's how people understood reality. But what happens instead when we read the story? The opposite. Something new is happening. Jesus touches him, and instead of becoming unclean, the leper is cleansed. In Jesus, something new is breaking in. And Luke wants us to notice. Jesus came announcing the kingdom of God is near. And in him, that nearness becomes visible, tangible, and lived out. The kingdom breaks in through his touch, through his words, and most significantly, through the hospitality of the table. And when it does, it brings nearness and welcome. Let's remember that uncleanliness wasn't about hygiene when you touched the leper. It was about distance. It was about separation. It was about loneliness. It meant if you touched the leper and you were unclean, it meant you can't go to the temple. You can't go near God. You and God are apart. The separation was real. Exclusion, oppression, it was felt and lived. It was lonely and devastating. And no one wanted that for themselves. So you avoided the other. Because the fear was always this: sin, impurity, disease, defilement will get on you. And once it does, it keeps you out. It keeps you far from God. It keeps you far from community. It keeps you far from belonging. So you didn't want that. It's easy for us to look at the Pharisees in our context, in our culture, and read and go, oh, those dumb Pharisees. Don't you know God loves everyone? Why are you not near people that are in pain and hurt and suffering? Why are you walking on the other side of the road when the man is bleeding on the side? Come on, Pharisees. But the law, the imagination, the understanding was that that would separate you from God. Why would you want to be separated from God? But here comes Jesus. And he flips it all upside down. Suddenly, it's not uncleanliness that's contagious. It's grace. In Jesus, nearness became visible, tangible. So Luke wants us to see the point clearly that in Jesus, grace comes near. And then we read from that story of Jesus touching the leper, doing this upside down thing that's unimaginable. We read in verses 17 to 26, another breakthrough. Jesus not only heals a paralyzed man, he forgives his sins. Now, forgiveness, we need to just remember to go back into the context and their understanding of this. Forgiveness in their world was centered where? In the temple, in the sacrifices, in the rituals. But Jesus speaks a word and sin is forgiven. No sacrifice, no priest, no temple. Jesus speaks and grace is given. Do you see? Something's new is happening. And it's hard to catch up. And this is the context of our story. There's something new happening. There's a leper being touched and he's healed. His sin is not transferred to Jesus. There's a man paralyzed brought down to Jesus and he forgives him his sins and then heals him. What's happening? So when Jesus goes to Levi's invitation to his banquet, he's not careless with who he dines with. He's bringing the holiness of God into contact with the unholy. And instead of the unholy contaminating him as is expected, the unholy is being changed. In Jesus, grace is becoming available to all. And it's possible because there was an invitation and acceptance. You can see now how hospitality is the soil in which evangelism grows in this new thing that Jesus is doing. Hospitality is the soil in which evangelism grows. He's not avoiding sin to get on him. He's entering in, coming closer, coming near. In Jesus, grace is becoming available to all. So Jesus embodies grace to Levi, to all those who have felt far removed from grace, who have been disqualified as people who are against God, and he offers forgiveness. To all those who have felt alienated from God, who have felt alienated from the temple, who have felt alienated from church. Jesus says, there's room for you at the table. God's grace has this way of reaching down into their mess, down into the places we'd rather avoid, down to each of us and say, follow me, follow me. We could respond like Levi and follow, drop everything, because I've been disqualified. And here's somebody who's invited me to follow? What? Or we can believe our own story and say, I am disqualified. There's no way. God, you don't know what I've done. One of my favorite stories, I always say this, I have a lot of favorites. But one of my favorite stories, books, and it's a play and a movie, and many of you probably read it or seen it, is Les Miserables. Story, and the English translation actually gives me like it feels like stronger, the miserable ones or the wretched. It feels like, ooh, maybe those of you that speak French are like, yeah, I already feel that already in French. You don't have to say that in English, but it does. It feels like the wretched feels a little heavier. But if you know the story, you'll remember that Jean Valjean, the main character in the story, he's just been released from prison after 19 long years, branded a criminal, rejected by society, turned away at every door. He's hungry, he's exhausted, he's unwanted. And then he knocks on the door of a priest, of a bishop, and the bishop not only lets him in, he sets the table for him. He gives him a meal, gives him the seat of honor, so he offers him not scraps, he gives him food. And Valjean sits there stunned, eating food he doesn't deserve, welcomed when he expected rejection. But here's the thing, he can't actually believe it. He can't believe this is real. He feels disqualified. He feels there's got to be a catch. There's lots of stuff. Maybe I'm forcing that part on him. But like when I watch this or read the book or watch the movie, I feel like there's stuff in him that's like, this can't be real. There's the shame and hardness of his past just clings to him. And that night he steals the bishop's silver and runs away. Of course, he's caught and dragged back, and he knows it's over. Back to prison I go for the rest of my life. But instead, those of you that know the story, the bishop does this unthinkable and says to him, he says, there you are, he exclaimed, looking down towards Jean Valjean. I'm glad to see you, but I gave you the candlesticks also, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not take them along with you, with your plates? And then between them, a little bit later, Bishop Muriel, this bishop, says to him, he says to Jean Valjean, forget not, never forget that you have promised me to use this silver to become an honest man. Jean Valjean, my brother, you belong no longer to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I'm buying for you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and from the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. In that moment, Valjean realizes that he's been shown grace he cannot earn and does not deserve. A grace that not only welcomes him to the table, but sends him away with a new life, and he's changed man forever. That's the power of grace at the table. A table where the undeserving are not only welcomed, but honored. A table where grace breaks the cycle of sin and shame. A table that changes everything. And just like Jean Valjean sitting at a table he didn't deserve, welcomed by grace that changed his life, we find ourselves here today, don't we? At the table. With the story of Levi that we just read, with the story of Mandela, and many, many stories circulating in our news cycle. And the question arises, with whom can I eat? Whose jersey can I wear? Who do I support? Who am I against? What silver do I need to protect or give away? Can we offer grace to those who we think are far from God? Can we offer grace and seat at the table to the ones who we think are dead wrong? The ones we think are evil? Can we come near them? Can we accept their invitation to their table? Can we eat with them? Can we actually be at the table with them? With whom can I eat? And we process this in real time, don't we? Our world is still marked by polarization, isn't it? Violence, war, murder, assassinations, weapons of war, bombs, drones, innocent dying. And then justifications and cycles of vengeance, who deserves what and who doesn't deserve it. Sharing posts on our social media, who got it right, who got it wrong. Am I getting a little close? Who deserves grace and who doesn't? Whom can I eat with? We see it in our news. We see it in our social media feeds. We see it in our neighborhoods. We see it in our world. And we see it in our hearts. I see it in my heart. And yet it is into this very world that the upside-down kingdom of Jesus breaks in. Not in the ways we expect, not through power, guns, violence, force, or domination, but through something so ordinary, so everyday, that you could almost miss it. And it just simply looks like the table of grace. When the noise of violence and hate fills our lives, when the world feels divided, angry, exhausted, when our news feeds are flooded with accusations and outrage, Jesus doesn't step back as if sin is going to get onto him, but he steps near. He comes close. He pulls up a chair. He extends an invitation. He lays the bread on the table, pours the wine into the cup, and says, "This is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Here's the kingdom, hidden in plain sight, friends. Grace offered, love embodied, God's nearness made visible at the table.